Her small fist pounded against the frozen pavement, her voice cracking through the snow. "Why did everyone walk past me? I'm not trash." The words cut the night in two. Daniel Whitmore, a man who had never been to boardrooms or billionaires, stopped cold because their huddled-in rags was a child staring at him like he was her last chance. Would you have walked away or stayed? Tell me what your heart whispers. Snow drifted lazily through the streets of London on Christmas Eve, clinging to the cobblestones and the iron railings of Westminster Bridge. Daniel Whitmore, one of the city's most recognizable CEOs, adjusted the collar of his long coat as he stepped out of his chauffeured car. The night was supposed to be simple, a solitary walk to clear his head before returning to his penthouse where a table was already set with food he would eat alone. His life, though overflowing with power and wealth, had grown quiet and mechanical since his wife passed away. He was a man known for closing impossible deals, for transforming struggling companies into empires, but in his personal world, silence was the only constant. He walked past the festive lights strung across the streets, past the sound of bells echoing from St. Paul's Cathedral. Families hurried by their laughter muffled by scarves, their arms full of last-minute gifts. It was a scene that might have warmed him once, but now only reminded him of what he had lost. His footsteps carried him away from the main square toward a side street less touched by holiday cheer. That was when he heard it so faint. He wondered if he imagined it a whisper curling through the air, fragile as the snow itself. "Sir, I just wanted to find my mom." Daniel froze mid-step. He turned, scanning the shadows behind a row of overflowing bins near a narrow alley. There, huddled against a wall of crumbling brick, was a small figure. A girl no older than 6, bundled in a coat that swallowed her tiny frame. One shoe clung to her foot, while the other lay discarded a few feet away. She had arranged flattened cardboard into a makeshift bed, her backpack shoved beneath her head like a pillow. The sight stole the breath from his lungs. For a man who had built a fortune on predicting outcomes and calculating risk, Daniel felt suddenly stripped of control. The girl's lips trembled as she lifted her face streaked red from the cold. Her brown eyes were dull, yet determined, her voice carrying a steady rhythm of truth that most adults could not manage. "I wanted to go to the hospital where Mommy works, but I got lost. I thought maybe if I slept, morning would come." She coughed a dry, rattling sound that made her shoulders shudder. Daniel's instinct pulled him forward before his mind could catch up. He knelt down in the snow, unwrapping the wool scarf from his neck and carefully draping it around her. She flinched at the sudden warmth, then clutched at the fabric with blue-tinged fingers. "Easy, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice thick, far softer than the one investors or board members ever heard. "You're safe now. I've got you." She blinked at him, trying to keep her eyes open against the exhaustion pressing down on her. "Mommy said, if I ever get lost, go where there's light." Her gaze flickered weakly toward the glowing facade of the Whitmore International Building towering above them. "That's why I came here." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat closing around emotions he had buried for years. The child had not chosen his building at random. She had followed the beacon that symbolized power security answers. And now she was looking to him for all of it. He had built a world on numbers and negotiations, but none of that prepared him for this. He slipped one arm beneath her fragile body and lifted her carefully. She sagged into his chest, her weight alarmingly light, her breath shallow against his coat. He could feel the icy chill radiating from her skin, and panic clawed at him, panic he hadn't felt since the night his own wife's heartbeat had faltered in a hospital bed years ago. "My name is Daniel," he whispered as he tightened his hold. "What's yours?" Her lips parted, but no sound came. She simply leaned into him, as if giving him her trust without words. That trust was heavier than anything he had ever carried. The snow fell harder now, a curtain of white muting the city sounds. Daniel shifted her carefully in his arms, pulling his phone from his pocket with one hand. His voice trembled as he spoke to the emergency dispatcher, giving the address, his words clipped with urgency. "I found a little girl outside in the cold. She's freezing, barely conscious. Please hurry." He ended the call and glanced once more at the spot where she had been lying, the cracked pink lunchbox beside the bins, the bent cardboard. It was not just a shelter. It had been her survival. He picked up the lunchbox with his free hand and pressed it against his side before striding back toward the main street. Within minutes, the wail of an ambulance siren sliced through the night, growing louder until red lights danced across the stone buildings. 2 paramedics rushed out, their voices sharp with focus, as they checked the girl's vitals. Daniel stood rooted, unwilling to release her, until one gently urged him toward the waiting stretcher. Even then, he lingered a moment longer, brushing a strand of tangled hair from her face. "Stay with her," one paramedic told him. Daniel nodded without hesitation. He climbed into the ambulance beside her, placing the battered lunchbox at her side as if it were treasure. The doors shut, sealing them in with the hum of machines and the urgency of trained hands. As the vehicle pulled away, weaving through traffic toward St. Mary's Hospital, Daniel Whitmore, the man who thought Christmas had nothing left to give him, tightened his grip around the little girl's hand and whispered almost to himself, "You're not alone anymore. Not tonight." In that moment, with the city's lights blurring beyond the glass and snow swirling endlessly outside, Daniel realized that his life built on control and calculation had just shifted on its axis. A child had appeared in the most unexpected way on the coldest of nights, and brought with her a truth he could no longer ignore. Sometimes the people who need us most are the ones we never planned to meet. The sterile brightness of St. Mary's Hospital stung Daniel Whitmore's eyes as he stepped out of the ambulance, still clutching the little girl's tiny hand. Nurses swept her onto a gurney, their voices urgent but steady, guiding her through double doors that swung open to reveal a corridor washed in white light. Daniel followed close behind, his tailored coat brushing against walls scuffed from years of stretchers rushing through. He had walked through countless boardrooms where millions hung in the balance, but here, watching a frail child disappear into a room filled with machines and sharp commands, he had never felt more powerless. The nurses spoke quickly, attaching monitors, wrapping a warm blanket around the girl, fitting an oxygen mask over her nose and mouth. The faint rise and fall of her chest reassured Daniel, but it was far too shallow. A doctor, his face lined with exhaustion from the holiday shift, turned to him. "How long was she outside?" "I don't know," Daniel admitted, his voice rough. "I found her in the cold, lying on cardboard. She was alone." The doctor's gaze softened briefly before turning back to the child. "We'll keep her stable. Severe hypothermia, malnourished too. She's dehydrated." He scribbled something on a chart, then nodded toward a chair. "You can wait here." Daniel sank into the chair, his hands curling into fists on his knees. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence, punctuated by the beeping rhythm of the heart monitor. His eyes refused to leave the little girl. Her face, flushed red from the cold, looked too fragile for this world. She should have been at home under a Christmas tree, not here fighting for warmth on a night meant for miracles. Minutes stretched like hours. Daniel's thoughts darted uncontrollably, colliding with fragments of memory he had kept buried. He saw his wife years earlier in a similar hospital room, the echo of her weakening heartbeat, the way he had clung to her hand as though it could anchor her to this world. And now, here he was again, holding on to a child he didn't even know, terrified of a loss he hadn't yet earned the right to feel. The girl stirred faintly, her lips moving beneath the mask. Daniel leaned forward, straining to hear, Her voice was barely audible, but the words carried weight beyond her size. Don't. Let them take me away. His chest tightened. He lowered himself beside her bed, brushing a damp curl from her forehead. No one is taking you away, I promise you, sweetheart. She opened her eyes, slightly glassy and unfocused. Mommy works here. She was supposed to come home. I was waiting, but she never did. Daniel's heart twisted at the raw honesty in her tone. She had carried herself through the freezing night with nothing but a fragile hope, an instinct to find the light. That thread of faith had led her to his building, as though the universe had decided to collide their paths. Do you remember your mother's name? He asked gently. Her fingers twitched against the blanket, trying to form letters in the air. She wears a blue jacket. It says St. Mary's. I think her name is Anna. The effort exhausted her, and her eyelids fluttered shut again. Daniel sat back, absorbing her words. Anna, a nurse maybe, a staff member here lost somewhere in this maze of corridors. He stood quickly searching for the doctor. She said her mother works here, Anna, in a blue jacket. Can you check the staff records? Maybe she's still on shift. The doctor hesitated, glancing at the girl, then at Daniel's expensive watch glinting under the light. I'll see what I can do, but tonight's been hectic. We had an unidentified patient brought in earlier, collapsed in a staff stairwell, mid-30s, no ID. She's in intensive care. We don't know who she is yet. The words cut through Daniel like a blade. Unidentified, mid-30s, a woman who might never wake up. He glanced back at the child, her small chest rising with each shallow breath. Was this the truth that had brought her here, staggering through the snow toward the glow of his building? As the doctor disappeared down the hall, Daniel returned to the girl's side. He didn't know why it mattered so much why this child had broken through the fortress he'd built around himself. But in her fragile voice, in her trembling grip on life, he heard something he had once lost, the refusal to give up, even when the world turned cold. Hours bled into the night. Nurses checked her vitals. Adjusted blankets brought warm fluids through an IV. Daniel stayed rising, only to pace the hallway, then returning to her side as if tethered by an invisible string. Through the small window in the door, he saw other families gathered around beds, whispering prayers, sharing hope. He envied them. Hope had long ago become a foreign language to him. But when the girl stirred again, her fingers reaching for the edge of the blanket, he leaned closer. She whispered something he almost didn't catch. Did I get it right? Is this where Mommy works? His throat ached. He reached for her small hand, wrapping it gently in his own. Yes, he said softly, though he could not be certain. This is St. Mary's. You're safe now. Her grip tightened faintly, as if clinging to that reassurance, to the promise of safety she had been chasing through the snow. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar, pressing against the grief he carried. It was small, fragile, but it glowed nonetheless. It was hope threading itself back into his heart through the hand of a child who refused to let go. The night deepened, and outside the window snowflakes spun like sparks under the street lamps. Inside the hospital, the rhythm of machines filled the silence with an uneasy lullaby. Daniel did not move from the girl's side. Whatever storm had led her here, whatever truth lay waiting beyond these walls, he knew one thing with absolute clarity: he would not let her face it alone. The next morning, Daniel Whitmore returned to St. Mary's earlier than he ever thought he would willingly enter a hospital. The December sky was still dark, the streets outside hushed beneath fresh snow, but inside the hospital a different kind of silence lingered, one of waiting. He carried 2 paper cups of coffee, one untouched in case the little girl stirred awake, though he doubted caffeine was the comfort she needed. He paused in the doorway of her room. The girl, he had learned her name at last. Sophie was curled beneath the blanket, her small hands wrapped tightly around the scarf he had given her. Even in sleep, she seemed to clutch it as if afraid it might vanish. He stood for a moment, allowing himself to take in the sight of her fragile chest, rising and falling before a nurse approached with a clipboard. "She's holding steady," the nurse said quietly. "Warmer now. We'll keep monitoring her." Daniel nodded, relief flooding him, though he did not say it aloud. His life had been one of numbers, results, and certainty. He was not used to resting his faith in a child's pulse. The nurse hesitated, then lowered her voice further. "Mr. Whitmore, about what you asked last night, the unidentified patient." She glanced at the sleeping girl before continuing. "The woman we admitted matches her description. She was found collapsed in the stairwell after her shift. No ID, no family listed. Her badge was missing, but staff recall her Anna Bennett, pediatric nurse. She's in intensive care." The name struck Daniel with a jolt that went beyond recognition. Anna Bennett. He knew that name, though. The memory came to him not as fact, but as a sudden sharp echo. He thanked the nurse, then followed her down the corridor toward the ICU. His footsteps slowed as they neared the glass doors, his chest tightening with something he had not felt in years, anticipation mixed with dread. Inside the room was dim lit only by the glow of machines and monitors. Anna lay motionless on the bed, her face pale, her blonde hair tangled across the pillow. Her hand rested limply on the blanket, a tube running from her arm. The sound of the heart monitor filled the air with a steady, fragile rhythm. Daniel stepped closer, and the memory surfaced with clarity. Years ago, in this very hospital, when his wife was in labor with their son, chaos had overtaken the delivery room. His wife's blood pressure had plummeted, her voice weak with fear. And amidst the storm there had been a nurse with calm eyes and a steady voice holding her hand, whispering reassurance, when Daniel himself had been too shaken to speak. "She's strong. So are you." Those words had anchored them until the cry of a newborn filled the room. His wife had later told him that nurse's name, Anna. Now, here she was again. Not the strong, unflinching presence he remembered, but a woman fighting for her own survival. Daniel reached for the edge of the bed, his fingers tightening against the metal rail. The irony was unbearable. The woman who once steadied his family was now broken and alone, with only a child wandering the streets in search of her. He lowered himself into the chair beside her bed. "You were there," he whispered, his voice trembling despite himself. "You helped my wife when I couldn't. You brought my son into this world, and now your daughter found me." He pressed a hand to his mouth, forcing back the tide of emotion threatening to spill. For the first time in years, he felt as though the past had folded back on itself, demanding that he face it. When he returned to Sophie, she was awake, her brown eyes wide and tired. She blinked at him, searching his face for answers. "Did you find her?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Daniel sat beside her, careful to keep his tone gentle. "I think I did. She's here in the hospital. She's very sick, but she's safe. She's not alone anymore." Sophie's lips quivered. "Can I see her?" "Not yet," Daniel said softly, stroking her hair. "The doctors are helping her. But I promise when it's time you'll be there." She nodded slowly, though tears pooled in her eyes. Daniel felt his chest ache at her quiet resilience, at the way she swallowed fear with a courage too heavy for a child. The day passed in fragments. Doctors rotated in and out, nurses adjusted IVs, social workers arrived with questions. Daniel answered what he could, his presence drawing curious glances. A wealthy CEO sitting vigil by a child who wasn't his. It was not the sort of story hospitals were used to. But Daniel didn't care. Later, in a small consultation room, a woman from social services laid a file on the table. Mr. Whitmore were required to step in. Sophie has no immediate guardian while her mother is incapacitated. If Anna doesn't regain consciousness soon, the child will be placed in emergency foster care. The words cut through him. He pictured Sophie waking in a stranger's house, stripped of the fragile thread of safety she had found. He remembered the promise he had whispered in the ambulance. "No one is taking you away." "She's not going anywhere," he said firmly, surprising even himself with the strength of his tone. "I'll take responsibility. I'll be whatever she needs me to be." The social worker studied him, pen poised above her papers. "That's not a small commitment. You'd be legally accountable until her mother recovers." Daniel met her gaze without wavering. "I understand. She came to me for help. I'm not turning away." That evening, when he returned to Sophie's side, she looked at him with a question unspoken in her eyes. He sat down, reaching for her small hand. "You don't need to worry about being sent away," he told her gently. "You'll stay here close to your mom, and I'll stay with you." She stared at him for a long moment before whispering, "Why, you don't even know me." Daniel felt the weight of the answer settle in his chest. "Because once, a long time ago, your mother helped my family when I couldn't. And because sometimes life gives us people we're meant to take care of, even if we don't expect it." Her fingers tightened around his. For the first time since he had found her in the cold, her eyes shone, not only with exhaustion, but with something else, a fragile, flickering trust. Daniel leaned back in the chair, the hum of the machines filling the silence. He thought of Anna in the ICU, of Sophie beside him, of his own son at home, waiting for a father who had spent years keeping his distance. And for the first time in years, he felt the truth pressing against him. The past was not finished with him. It was alive, staring him in the face and asking what kind of man he would choose to be now. The days that followed unfolded like pages in a story Daniel never expected to be part of. He divided his time between the hospital and his home, where his son Oliver waited with questions he barely knew how to answer. Oliver was 8, sharp-eyed and sensitive, carrying in his silence the grief of losing his mother years before. For so long, it had been just the two of them, their lives stitched together by routine. Now, without warning, another child had entered their orbit, and Daniel could feel the fragile balance of their world tilting. At St. Mary's, Sophie clung to her mother's bedside, her little hands drawing pictures on scrap paper provided by the nurses. Sometimes they were stick figures of herself and Anna under a bright sun, sometimes sketches of Christmas trees with crooked ornaments. She placed them carefully on the wall beside the machines, as if decorating the sterile room into something resembling home. Daniel watched her, struck by her determination to create joy, even in the most fragile spaces. In the evenings, when Oliver came to visit, tension clung to the boy's shoulders. He would stand in the doorway of the hospital room, watching his father bend close to Sophie, listening as Daniel read aloud from a worn storybook. It was a ritual Oliver had once cherished, but in recent years those moments had faded as Daniel buried himself in work. Now, seeing his father's voice soften for another child, jealousy tangled with the ache of longing. One evening, after Sophie had drifted to sleep in the small cot beside her mother, Oliver lingered in the hallway. Daniel stepped out and found him leaning against the wall, fists shoved in his coat pockets. "You used to read to me," Oliver said quietly, his eyes fixed on the floor. Daniel felt the words hit him like a blow. He crouched down, searching his son's face. "I thought you were getting too old for bedtime stories." "I wasn't," Oliver replied, his voice breaking with emotion he tried to hide. "Not really." A silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of things left unsaid. Daniel reached out, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "I can read to you again. Tonight, if you want. Every night if you ask. That hasn't changed, Oliver. You're still my first thought." Oliver swallowed hard, his gaze finally lifting to meet his father's. "Then why do you look happy again?" "You smile more, with her, with them." Daniel's throat tightened. He took a steady breath. "Because Sophie reminds me of you when you were smaller, brave, curious, stronger than you realized. And because her mother, she has no one else. Helping them doesn't mean loving you less. It just means our world might be bigger than I thought it could be." The boy was silent for a long moment, then whispered, "I don't want to lose you." "You won't," Daniel said firmly. "Not ever. You and I, we're a team. That will never change." That night, back at their townhouse, Daniel kept his promise. He pulled the old storybook from Oliver's shelf, its spine frayed from years of use, and read aloud beneath the glow of the bedside lamp. Oliver curled closer than he had in years, his eyes closing as the familiar words carried him into sleep. When Daniel closed the book, he sat for a long time, realizing how easily he had let precious rituals slip away, and how deeply he wanted them back. At the hospital, Christmas morning dawned with pale light spilling across the windows. Daniel arrived with a small tree hastily decorated with paper snowflakes he and Oliver had cut the night before. Sophie's eyes lit up when she saw it, her laughter filling the room with a sound that seemed to push back the hum of machines. Oliver, standing awkwardly beside her, handed her a package wrapped in crumpled red paper. "It's not much," he muttered. Sophie peeled it open carefully to reveal a set of crayons and a small notebook. Her smile widened, and she threw her arms around him with sudden force. "It's perfect." Oliver stiffened, then slowly relaxed his arms, returning the hug. In that moment something shifted between them, the first fragile thread of connection weaving itself into place. Anna remained unconscious, her breathing steadier but still fragile. Each day, Daniel sat beside her, speaking softly, telling her about Sophie's drawings, about Oliver's quiet bravery, about the way the two children had begun to orbit one another like siblings, testing the shape of their bond. He didn't know if Anna could hear him, but he spoke as though his words could anchor her back to them. The nurses began calling Sophie and Oliver the Snowstorm siblings, a nickname that made Sophie beam, and Oliver roll his eyes, though he secretly carried it with pride. Together they created paper garlands for the tree, whispered stories under the blankets in the waiting room, and waited for news that Anna might wake. For Daniel, the hospital became less a place of fear and more a place of quiet transformation. He found himself arranging his work around visits, dialing into meetings from corners of the lounge, caring less about quarterly reports and more about whether Sophie had eaten breakfast or Oliver felt seen. It was disorienting the way his priorities shifted without permission, but it was also freeing. For the first time since his wife's death, he felt the stirrings of life beyond grief. One afternoon, while Sophie colored beside her mother's bed and Oliver attempted to teach her how to play a simple card game, Daniel stepped back watching them. Their laughter mingled awkward at first, then genuine. He saw in their smiles something he hadn't allowed himself to believe possible, a glimpse of family not bound by blood, but by choice, by the fragile decision to stay. Later, as the children dozed in chairs too large for their small bodies, Daniel leaned close to Anna's still form. "You once held my wife's hand when I couldn't. You carried us through a storm we thought we couldn't survive. Now, your daughter has done the same for me. I don't know if you can hear this, but if you return to her, you'll find us waiting. Not out of obligation, but because she deserves more than survival. She deserves a family." The machines hummed steadily, the only reply. Yet Daniel felt something shift inside him. He had spent years building walls, convinced that safety lay in solitude. Now, as he looked at the two sleeping children curled near the bed, he realized safety had never been the goal. Connection was. and somehow in the most unexpected way they were building it together. When the nurse dimmed the lights for the night, Daniel pulled blankets over Oliver and Sophie, adjusting them gently so their heads rested comfortably. He sat back in the chair beside Anna, exhaustion heavy, but strangely welcome. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man defined by loss. He felt like someone standing at the edge of something new, uncertain, fragile, but undeniably alive. In that quiet room, surrounded by children who had begun to call each other brother and sister, Daniel Whitmore understood that families were not always born in the ways the world expected. Sometimes they were built out of broken nights, whispered promises, and the willingness to choose love over fear. And as the snow fell softly beyond the window, he allowed himself to believe, if only for a moment, that they were building something that might last. The room was quiet except for the steady hum of machines. Daniel Whitmore had learned to measure time by the rhythm of the monitors, the rise and fall of Sophie's breath against the silence, and the stillness of Anna's body in the bed. He had almost grown used to the waiting, the not knowing. But that morning, something changed. Anna's fingers twitched a small tremor beneath the blanket, so faint he thought he imagined it. Then her lips parted, and a single word broke the air. Sophie Daniel shot to his feet, his heart hammering. "She's here," he said, his voice breaking. "She's right here." The door opened just as Sophie hurried in, her small shoes squeaking on the linoleum. She froze when she saw her mother's eyes, half open, the faintest light flickering behind them. "Mommy!" she cried, racing forward, climbing awkwardly onto the bed. She pressed her face into Anna's chest, sobbing with relief. "I found you. I waited, like you said." Anna's arm lifted with trembling effort, her hand brushing against her daughter's hair. Her voice was fragile but steady. "You were so brave." Daniel stood back, the scene unfolding like a miracle he hadn't dared hope for. Sophie clung to her mother, whispering words between her tears. The machines continued their measured chorus, but the room felt transformed, charged with the unexplainable power of a promise kept. Oliver lingered in the doorway, his hands deep in his pockets. He looked unsure, caught between the instinct to leave and the pull to belong. Anna noticed him, her gaze softening even through her exhaustion. "And who is this?" Daniel placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "This is Oliver, my boy." Sophie turned quickly, her smile bright through damp cheeks. "He's my big brother now. He takes care of me when you're sleeping." Oliver blushed, glancing down at his shoes. Anna's lips curved faintly. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes shining at the boy who had quietly stepped into her daughter's world. The days that followed were full of cautious joy. Anna's strength grew little by little, her voice steadier, her color slowly returning. Sophie rarely left her side, drawing more pictures, filling the walls with color. Oliver began to join her sometimes, reading aloud, sometimes just sitting quietly, his presence a comfort Sophie never questioned. Daniel watched them both, his chest tight with a mixture of pride and awe. One evening, Daniel carried in a small potted Christmas tree, its branches uneven, decorated with paper stars cut by Sophie and Oliver. He set it by the window where the lights of the city shimmered in the distance. Sophie clapped her hands in delight. Oliver smirked, as if pretending it wasn't special, and Anna's eyes filled with tears. She reached for Daniel's hand, her fingers weak but sure. "I thought I was meant to do this alone," she murmured. "Just survive for her. But now, you don't have to anymore," Daniel said softly. "You were never meant to carry it all alone." Sophie tugged at his sleeve, then her voice clear and certain. "Daddy Daniel, thank you for finding me." The words pierced him tender and fierce all at once. He crouched to her level, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "Thank you for letting me." A year later, snow blanketed the streets of London, and laughter filled the Whitmore townhouse near Hyde Park. The tree glowed with mismatched ornaments. The scent of cinnamon drifted from the kitchen, and two children sprawled on the floor unwrapping gifts with shrieks of joy. Sophie held a handmade book from Oliver, its pages filled with drawings of their journey, and she hugged him so tightly he laughed in protest. From the kitchen doorway, Anna watched her smile, radiant, her eyes full of gratitude. Daniel stepped beside her, handing her a mug of cocoa, the way she liked, with marshmallows melting on top. She met his gaze, and for a long moment neither spoke. Words weren't needed. Daniel thought of that night a year ago, of a child huddled in the cold, and of how everything had changed because she had followed the light. He had believed his life was over, closed off, defined by loss. But here they were, a family rebuilt from brokenness, not by blood or chance, but by choice. And as the snow fell softly against the windows, Daniel knew they were no longer alone. They were finally home. On that cold Christmas Eve in London, Daniel Whitmore believed his life had settled into a pattern of silence and loss. A man who once commanded boardrooms with confidence now carried only the emptiness left behind by grief. Yet fate intervened when he stumbled upon a child, Sophie, sleeping on discarded cardboard, her tiny body fighting against the freezing night. That single encounter unraveled the walls he had built around himself and forced him to face a truth he had long denied: even the strongest among us need connection, and even the most guarded hearts can be broken open by compassion. Through Sophie, Daniel was drawn into a story he never expected to live. She wasn't just any child. She was searching for her mother, Anna Bennett, who lay unconscious in the very hospital Sophie had tried to reach. And Anna wasn't a stranger to Daniel either, years before she had been the nurse who held his wife's hand in a moment when he could not. The invisible threads of the past had woven their lives together once, and now those threads returned, pulling them toward one another again. What began as an act of responsibility soon became something deeper. Daniel stayed at Sophie's side when others might have left. He watched Oliver, his own son, wrestle with the fear of being replaced, and together they found healing in learning how to open their world to someone new. Sophie and Oliver, once strangers, began to laugh, play, and even fight like siblings, discovering strength in each other's company. Anna's slow recovery mirrored Daniel's own journey. The man who once believed his heart had nothing left to give found himself reawakening to love, hope, and the meaning of family. When Anna finally opened her eyes, the miracle was not only medical, it was emotional, spiritual. Her daughter's determination had brought her back, and Daniel and Oliver had been there to welcome her into a new life. 1 year later, the Whitmore home was no longer empty. It was filled with the sounds of children laughing, the glow of mismatched ornaments on a Christmas tree, and the warmth of a family built not by bloodline, but by choice. The lesson from their journey is powerful family is not always defined by names or documents, but by the people who choose to stay. It is about the hands we reach for in the storm, the promises we keep even when no one expects us to, and the courage to love again after pain convinces us it's impossible. Daniel's life reminds us that sometimes the miracle we are waiting for doesn't arrive in the form of success or wealth. It arrives in the form of a small voice in the dark, asking not to be left alone. For each of us, the invitation is the same. In our everyday lives, we may encounter people who feel unseen, abandoned, or hopeless. We can choose to look away, or we can choose, as Daniel did, to step closer. The act of staying, of caring, may change not only their lives, but our own. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your reflections. Have you ever experienced a moment when helping someone else unexpectedly changed you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and please don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support inspires us to continue bringing stories like this, stories of hope, resilience, and second chances that remind us all we are never truly alone.